Well, good afternoon and welcome to Round the Table with Christian Concern, live here on Facebook and YouTube. It's great to see you, great to catch up with you. And today we have a special guest, Dr. Mark Pickering, who is Chief Executive of the Christian Medical Fellowship. Mark,
Afternoon,
great
Tim.
to see you. How are you today?
Oh, very well, thank you. Yeah, it's good to be here.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to the conversation we've got to have today, because the British Medical Association has made some quite big decisions, or at least come out in favour of making DIY abortion permanent, and also in favour of making it easier to change gender. So we'll come on to that. I want to also invite Dr. Carys Moseley onto the call here as well, our policy researcher and expert in some of these issues over in Wales there. Carys, nice to see you.
Yes, thank you.
Great. So Mark, tell us about your role at Christian Medical Fellowship and what the Christian Medical Fellowship does.
Great, thanks, Tim. So we're a national fellowship of around 5,000 Christian doctors, nurses, midwives, and their respective students. So our mission is uniting and equipping Christian doctors and nurses to live and speak for Jesus. And that pretty much says it all. So wherever a doctor or nurse or a student of those disciplines, wherever their faith impacts their professional career, we're there to help them. So we have a number of our members working overseas, either long-term or short-term. We do conferences and resources and national support networks for our members in all the different things that they do. We help them with sharing faith with colleagues and when appropriately, and with patients as well. And we do quite a bit in terms of public policy. So where our members are impacted by issues like the ones we'll be talking about today, we help to inform and educate them and to help them bring their voice to the public table.
Great. Well, I think that's a vital and important role, and a really significant role. If you know someone who's a medic, a doctor of some kind, then do connect them with CMF. We've just put their website up there on the chat lines. And if you've got questions for Mark, do post them on YouTube or Facebook, and we will spot them and listen and see if we can raise them and get some of Mark's wisdom to bear on the issues. So, Mark, we're talking about the BMA and the British Medical Association, BMA. Tell us about what the BME is and how it works and what kind of organisation it is, and are you a member of it, and is everyone in CMF a member of it? How does it work?
Great, thanks. Good question. So the British Medical Association has a dual role. It's the main doctors' professional body, so it represents doctors and also the interests of doctors and the things that doctors want to campaign on across the UK. And then it's also our trade union. So it's different to most trade unions in that, yes, they do campaign about pay and conditions and pensions and all that sort of thing, and you'll sometimes see them in the news about that. And that can be, I suppose, the more self-serving side to that. But also they do some fantastic work on ethical issues, on care for vulnerable patient groups, on campaigning for a better NHS that's better funded for patients and for different groups of patients, and you know, the quality and service design and that sort of thing. So it's a huge organisation. It's about 180,000 members, and
Right.
They have local divisions in all the medical schools and all around the nation, and then they have lots of different committees and work streams to work on different areas.
So, is it the biggest organisation of doctors, medics, or
it
not?
Is. Yeah, it is. So they often, you know, I think their strapline is the voice of doctors, and that's pretty much a good way to put it. So there are lots of Royal Colleges and specialty organisations like the Royal College of GPs, Royal College of Surgeons, Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists or Psychiatrists, and they all represent their own specialty in different ways. So you'll often see them.
So those are really, am I right in thinking those are really professional bodies, whereas the BMA is more of a union? Would that be fair?
Exactly, yeah. So they do have
Right.
a representative function, but the BMA has more of that union function as well. And those different bodies will speak out where their particular specialty is involved in something, but the
Right.
BMA is generic. So it's really it's the biggest and most important of all the medical organisations within the UK.
And is it representing GPs or nurses or anybody in medicine, or how does it work?
So not nurses. So you have the Royal College of Nursing, the
Right.
RCN, and that provides a similar function to the BMA, but for nurses. And I think midwives are also represented, but by the RCN.
Right.
But the BMA is just for doctors and medical students at the moment.
Right. Right. Okay. And then they've made this two big decisions, or two big things that they've come out with this week. I think you were at the meeting, were you, this week?
I was, yeah. So the
In what
annual.
capacity are you there? Were you at the
I was
meeting?
there as a delegate, so I'm a member of the BMA, and all BMA members are eligible to be delegates at the annual meeting.
Right.
So the BMA has various committees and meetings during the year, and it's governed by a council. But because of their union function, then they have what's called an annual representatives meeting. So there's usually about 600 members there,
Wow.
and it's made up of representatives from all the different local divisions and conferences and committees, and you can apply for a delegate role there. And I've
Right.
been a delegate at the ARM for roughly the last 10 years each year. So you have an agenda across those 4 days, which is all made up of motions submitted from different divisions and parts of the BMA, and then there's an agenda committee that orders all of those and puts the most important ones on for debate.
Right.
But because of COVID, that 4-day residential meeting was truncated to a 1-day online meeting, which took place this Tuesday.
Right. Wow. So they passed all these motions in one day, did they?
Yeah, so there are usually hundreds of motions, but you get them cut down to probably less than 100 motions across the 4 days, because each motion takes about 15 or 20 minutes to debate, and then there are various other things like the AGM happens during that time. So we prioritized, I think, 12 main motions during the day, and then there's a few other emergency ones. And because of the truncation of it for COVID, a lot of the day was focused on COVID-related issues. So rebuilding the NHS after COVID, and talking about PPE and testing and that sort of thing. So the kind of things that you would have seen in the news simply related to COVID.
Right.
But
so when the BMA comes out with this announcement, and maybe my friends can link to it on the feed, doctors' back calls continue remote prescription of early abortion pills. So they're basically saying that the DIY abortions, which were legalized explicitly for coronavirus because people couldn't travel to clinics, and we were locked down, all that kind of thing, and that was the excuse given to allow these home abortions, even though actually you could still go to a clinic. And then now they've continued it, even though clinics are now open again and people can go. And then the BMA is saying, right, this should be made permanent, right? So on what basis is the BMA saying that? Was there a vote at the meeting? Is that how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really good to understand that, because when you see in the news, the BMA backs this, you need to understand at what level that decision's been made and how it came about. So the two particularly controversial motions at this year's ARM were on transgender rights and support and on home abortions. Yeah. And it's a very good question to ask, well, why did the BMA think that they were the most important things to debate in the middle of COVID when so many other things were pushed off the agenda? But on the DIY home abortions, as I said before, each of these motions, they get put forward by individual divisions or committees. So basically, I think it was the Islington division, which has historically been very much pro-abortion. They put this motion forward, and then that was deemed worthy of inclusion in the main agenda by the agenda committee. And again, it all comes down to who on the agenda committee thinks that this motion is more important than that motion. So this motion came up for debate, and then you have somebody proposes it, somebody speaks against it, and then depending on how many delegates get forward to speak for or against it, then the chair of council will give their opinion, and the chair of the relevant committee will give their opinion, and then the delegates will vote on it. So it's really down to what happens in the hall on that day or on the online platform. And so there has not been any sort of groundswell of BMA members.
So let me just get this straight. So there's 180,000 members.
Yep.
And then there's 600 people at the actual meeting. And then the decision is made on the basis of a vote of the 600 people, is it?
Yep, absolutely. 600 is about the normal number that comes to a physical a physical ARM. I'm not quite clear on how many members were there at this online ARM. Certainly from the voting numbers that I saw, often each vote was being done by about 300 delegates. So I'm not sure if some people weren't voting or just weren't present at that time. But
Right.
you're basically talking about 300 votes that were being counted during each of these motions. And
Right.
because of the intensity of the ARM, you will get some people who are very passionate, very well informed on a particular motion, and some people who know nothing about the background of it, haven't thought about it. They hear the speeches, and then they may listen to the speeches, or they may simply go with what they thought before, regardless of what the speeches say.
Right. So
And I think
I've got a question here from John Winlow on Facebook. Who's sort of saying, although it's a democratic organization, presumably there'll be lobbying and special interest groups and factions and that kind of thing. Is that right, or not really?
Yeah, totally. That's exactly the case, and you saw that very much in both the transgender motion and the abortion one this week. So the motion was put forward by Wendy Savage, who's a retired obstetrician, and she is very, very much pro-abortion. She herself has carried out thousands of abortions over the years and been a really strong campaigner for it. So it's no surprise at all that she is pushing that agenda. But I think what was really surprising in the debate here, that there were some really strong speeches, two really strong speeches against the motion itself. And some of your listeners will know that obviously Christian Concern have been involved in the judicial review, looking at that initial decision by the government to allow the home abortions during the COVID. And there have been lots of concerns about the safety of it. And during that process of the judicial review, a leaked NHS email has come to light from a regional chief midwife back in May. So this was only 2 months after the new regulations came in, and that was listing some really quite concerning things. They talked about 2 women who've died as the use of this pills by post scheme, talked about a stillborn baby at 28 weeks that the police were investigating. And let's not forget the cutoff was meant to be 10 weeks. So clearly something has gone very wrong, either with the woman estimating her dates or perhaps knowingly giving wrong dates in order to procure what is an illegal abortion under any circumstances. And there was another woman who, there was a near miss at 32 weeks when she was passed to get the pills, but then had second thoughts herself and went off and got a scan to check her dates and turned out to be 32 weeks pregnant. So some massive concerns.
Wow.
And those things were highlighted in the speeches. But I think the really shocking thing was that in the summing up of the debate, Wendy Savage dismissed that evidence purely as pro-life propaganda. And I don't...
Pro-life propaganda?
Essentially, and I don't think that Wendy knew anything of what that evidence was, but I think there's a real tendency just to say, oh, we just dismiss that because you're pro-life, therefore we don't need to trust you. But what was more concerning was actually the chair of the ethics committee, John Chisholm, who carries a lot of weight in these kind of debates, essentially did exactly the same thing, and he stated that the 2 speakers had misled the meeting, and that's a very serious charge to make.
The meeting? Because they were bringing this evidence of a email from an NHS, proper NHS email, they were accused of misleading the meeting.
Yes, yes, and I was very concerned by that use of words. I think Wendy Savage was more conciliatory in that she suggested that they had been misled, the speakers, by pro-life propaganda. But John Chisholm's words, I think were very concerning in that he said that they had misled the meeting. You know, if you hear of an MP misleading Parliament, that's a very serious charge.
Sure.
And so, you know, you might say he just sort of got his words mixed up, but you know that basically carries a huge amount of weight in the meeting, and people voted for it. But I think it's very, very serious to just dismiss that kind of evidence, and we certainly plan to follow up with those speakers and say, well, on what basis are you discounting that evidence? Are you actually even aware of the evidence that's come? Because the evidence that was put to the meeting from Wendy Savage and John Chisholm was essentially from the abortion industry. So they were saying that there's been all these robust safeguards. The British Society of Abortion Care Providers, BPAS, Marie Stopes, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have all said that it's working really well. But again, they are all the people who carry out abortions, and you know, we would quite understandably say, well, are they really actually looking at evidence to the contrary, or are they just dismissing that? So when we hear that, you know, the BMA has said this, you're talking about around 300 votes, many of them being people who are
Are they secret votes, or was somebody's asking this? Are they secret votes or are they public votes?
Normally, when you're in a physical meeting, then people, you know, raise their cards and you can do that. But on the more controversial things, it's done on an electronic button vote. So you don't. So they are secret in this sense.
Right.
And because of the nature of the meeting on Tuesday, we didn't get the sort of proportions of them, and we certainly don't know who voted. So I don't know how clearly that was passed. But I think it is hugely concerning, and we have to, you know, take that step back to March, and again the points that were made in the speeches, and say this was a measure that was brought in during an emergency when there really was you know, grave concern that a woman asking for a legal abortion simply could not get to the clinic to have it done. And so you can understand the government saying, well, we need to do something pragmatic now, and those regulations those regulations last either for 3 years or until the COVID pandemic is declared to be over. So there's no rush to bring them in at all at the moment. But I think that this is really the abortion lobby saying, haha, we've seen our opportunity. We've always wanted to get this forward, and we've got a foot in the door, and we're just going to do what we can. So it's really the government that will decide, and hopefully the fact that the BMA has done
maybe a judge will decide. Maybe we're still waiting for the results in our legal case on that.
This is true. This is true.
And the legal case is saying it was illegal to bring this about in the first place. And if the judges, well, it's actually 3 judges, isn't it? If we're still waiting for that judgment, if the judges come and say, you know, that was illegal, then you know, we'll be back to square one on this. But we'll wait and see. Carys, tell me what you're thinking about the effect of this on public policy generally.
Well, I think obviously we've heard the side of, you know, the inside story about the doctors, which is more detail than we get on the BMA news site, of course, which didn't quote the chair of the ethics committee directly, quoted him indirectly, which I think now sounds very, very political, don't you say? I think when you're thinking from the point of view of the general public, and especially if you hold to the sanctity of life, DIY abortions, as one of the speakers who was quoted on the BMA news site said, you can't have ultrasound, right? And that makes the unborn child invisible to others, to the mother. Yeah. You can't have the photo, you know, in the scan in the hospital or whatever. And I think, you know, DIY abortions hide murder. They hide abortion from people, and even from the women who are taking part in a sense, until it's too late. And I think that's very telling. So there is a sort of attitude of hiding and deceit coming from large sections of the medical profession here, and that's of concern because it's a trade union, and trade unions are supposed to stick up for those who are wronged in the workplace. And how do you prove that? Well, by telling the truth about things. And I'm sure I'll be saying the same thing about the transgender issue as well. But it's very concerning that this is a trade union as well as a professional body. And I do wish that doctors would think about organising themselves accordingly in respect to that.
So Mark, can I ask? How influential will this decision be in Parliament? Let's assume it does go to Parliament, right? How influential will it be? Because here we are, right? 300 people out of 180,000 have, in a vote, said yes, home abortion should be allowed to continue forevermore. And then, the politicians are told, right, the British Medical Association, the biggest organisation for doctors, says we should make this permanent. And tell us, what do you think? How influential are these decisions?
Well, I think, if you just read the news coverage, as Carys has said, you look at how it's covered on the BMA website, you would think it was, the BMA has really considered this, but actually it is, it's 300 votes from 180,000 and with quite a biased debate in the way that was handled.
15-minute debate as well, only 15 minutes.
Something like that, that's right. So you do have to bear that in mind. Now, when the domestic abuse bill was going through Parliament not so long ago, there was an effort to bring in the same thing then. By the back door, and thankfully that was withdrawn. But the government then said that they would consult more on how these telemedicine provisions are working, and I think it's really essential that the government actually looks at robust evidence and not just abortion care providers saying, well, this is what women tell us when we speak to them, because of course it's a really highly selected group, and women who are harmed by these or who feel that they've been rushed through afterwards and have regret, they don't go back to the abortion providers and say, why did you do this to me? Why didn't you tell me about that? That we need to hear from the abortion care providers about how it's working, but their story is by no means the whole story. So it's essential to do that. And I think I'm just hopeful that the actual detail of the BMA debate will be heard by Parliament at the appropriate stage, so that it can't just be a whitewash from that.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll hope and pray that. And in the meantime, it's worth remembering that 90,000 babies have been killed with these home abortions. That's twice as many as people have died from COVID through this whole thing. So it is a catastrophe. It is worse than the pandemic. And doctors now saying this should be legalized is extraordinary. But then we've got to move on to the next topic, which is almost even worse potentially. I don't know. I mean, so the BMA announced that they want to demedicalize. Is that right, Mark? I'm asking you. Demedicalize gender transition.
Yeah.
At the moment, you need to self-identify in a new gender for 2 years and get a doctor to sign it off. And they want to say, no, forget all that. You should just be able to say, I'm now a woman. And off you go. Can you talk us through this, Mark? How did this happen as well?
Yeah, quite. So the Gender Recognition Act is the current piece of legislation that, in order to get a full gender transition, to get your birth certificate reissued in your acquired gender, then that's the piece of legislation people need to go through. And it is, reasonably time consuming and complex. You have to go to a doctor or suitably qualified professional. You need to get a recommendation. You need to pay a fee. You need to go through a time process, and some trans-identifying people will understandably find that demeaning, the idea that a medical doctor has to somehow validate their internal identity. And of course, because we're being given the message so consistently that being trans is simply about how you feel, that you don't need someone else to validate that, I can understand how it might seem patronizing and demeaning. Now, most trans people don't even go down that route. It's only a minority of trans people who will actually go to the extent of getting their birth certificate reissued and that sort of thing. But there's been, for a long time, there have been moves to what we call self-identification, when it's all you have to do is make a sworn statement to say, I am now this gender, and for that to affect your legal recognition. And that's coming very much from trans activists, and many people in the public will see that seems okay because they're given the trans affirming narrative from people. But there are some really serious concerns about oversimplifying that and the unintended consequences. So they understand the government not so long ago said that they wouldn't be reforming the Gender Recognition Act, and that led to an outcry about that. But I think the BMA is trying to bring more pressure to that by changing their policy. And so this particular motion from the BMA, it started out with a very understandable background to it, that trans people need to access healthcare that respects their dignity and treats them with respect. And of course, there's no question about that. Yeah. But it's promoting this idea that all trans people should simply be able to self-identify, that there doesn't have to be a legal process or a time scale or anything for people to go through. And that was proposed by a trans junior doctor at the BMA. And I think because of the trade union nature of the BMA, you do get a lot of heavily left-leaning members there, and particularly amongst some of the younger element, the sort of machinery of those who are on committees. You get a very, very strong left-leaning, trans-affirming sort of mentality, and I think it's very difficult to speak up and ask questions about that. We saw that very much in this debate. So because it was a complex issue, a complex multi-part motion as well, then the BMA ethics department, so that's the staff department, they produced what was a very helpful briefing paper saying, well, this is the current legal landscape, this is how things are, this is what happened with the Gender Recognition Act, this is what requests are being made. And they talked about some of the potential unintended consequences. So for instance, there have been some high-profile cases when male to female transgender individuals who are within the custodial system have managed to get from a male prison into a female prison to respect their rights. But then if you have someone who's a sex offender, then they're in a female prison, and then that makes, basically, a person with a penis who's and testosterone who identifies as a female can still be then in a female space, such as a female prison or perhaps a women's refuge, a domestic.
And there have been sexual assaults in female prisons as a result of this.
And they have, and yeah. Obviously they're high profile, and quite rightly, the briefing paper highlighted that these are a minority, but you can't make a wholesale change that doesn't take these things into account. And so the briefing paper initially did mention these in quite a balanced way, but just before the meeting, I think about 2 days before the meeting, we were informed that that briefing paper had been withdrawn and it was being urgently rewritten. And then on the day, probably only about an hour or two before the actual debate took place, the briefing paper was recirculated, apparently on the advice of a QC. So it must have had some quite high-level legal input to it. And some of these sections that highlighted some of the potential unintended consequences had simply been withdrawn from the paper. Now, we weren't told exactly why or exactly what had come up about that, but it just seemed to be a very hasty cowing to pressure from the powerful trans lobby within the BMA, and it just had a very uncomfortable feel to it, really. Now the debate went ahead much as you'd expect, and I spoke out on that, highlighting some of these concerns that we have, and really suggesting that we ask the BMA's ethics committee to go ahead and propose a sensible kind of moderate policy that would take these things into account. But that was discounted, and the motion passed in all of its parts. What was quite interesting, and that you wouldn't again see in the write-up, was there was quite a high level of abstention. So all of the parts passed, but in all of those 5 parts of the motion, between 14 and 18% of those voting actually abstained. So I think that tells us that there was quite a high level of disquiet and unease from people on the voting there, that they really were feeling a bit pushed into things. It was more complex than there was time to explore, and they just didn't feel able to express an opinion.
And again, it was only 300 votes or so altogether.
Something like that. I don't have the exact numbers. I have the percentages of the votes because they were quoted, but I don't have the actual numbers.
Right.
But yeah, you're talking just a few hundred of 18,000, again with a very hasty, rewriting of a briefing paper, and clearly a very high emotion being expressed within these debates. Again, from people basically saying, look, if you say these things, then you're opposing us as people. People talked about moral panic and how transgender people are being highlighted as sort of scapegoated for moral panic. But really, it was going beyond the level of rational debate, and there was a lot of emotion about it.
Yeah. So, Carys, give us your angle on this, because you're concerned about how this affects the medical profession generally, aren't you?
I think the thing is that when we hear that doctors support self-identification, they don't want a medical text. But how it comes across is that doctors want to wash their hands of the problems, because they're psychiatric problems really, or behavioural, or there's something else that people haven't addressed. And the treatment protocols, as everywhere now, including where I live in Wales, where they held out a bit more with the gatekeeper system, is that GPs don't have to send somebody who says they have genital dysphoria to the NHS psychiatrists in the same area. They can send them, or they should refer them, straight to the gender identity clinic. And of course, anything could happen. And I mean, yes, some gender clinics may cooperate more than others with psychiatrists and how to find the underlying issues that many people do have. There's no guarantee of that, really, I suspect. I think, also by voting against the system of medical checks, the doctors are effectively the BMA, not all doctors, because many don't belong to the BMA, but making it more likely that they're going to be forced to lie in the workplace about somebody's biological sex. And you're going to go around, and as you said about prisoners, saying, men have, women have penises and all this rubbish. And surely that must affect the integrity and clarity of mind of medical students and of those who teach them. Because what we're not hearing so far is how this is affecting medical schools. And it's going to trickle down into what else? A-level biology? Where will it end? So I think the BMA, it's acting, sounds like what your reporter, having been there, it's acting like a typical trade union, but needs to be reminded why trade unions exist, which is not just for lobby groups, but to serve a profession and to help preserve the integrity of doctors against agendas forced on them that can't treat in medicine. That's what I would say.
I think they're really good points, Carys, and you're right. These messages do trickle down, and I think one of the main things or the two main things that we're seeing is firstly confusion over language. So people are, I'm not sure if sort of being forced to lie is really quite accurate, because I think people are just convinced that this is the truth, that the language is being bent, and people are words are shifting, and then people are feeling a need to speak out of respect for somebody, but actually to use words in a way that are quite confusing. So that change of language is very concerning. Confusion about what people are actually claiming and what evidence actually says, that is widespread. But then also fear, and you see that fear all across. And you mentioned that the BMA is really acting as a trade union. Yes, it is, but in many ways it's acting as a pressure group. And I think because of this level of fear, it's very difficult for people to actually ask questions, because you get shot down very quickly. You can be very quickly declared as transphobic simply for saying, well, actually, we need to strike a balance here. One of the things we haven't mentioned is the effect on children. And that was also part of the motion that was passed. It was saying that under 18 should be able to access trans-affirming therapy, just like other young people can access other medical things. We've seen, of course, there are some real concerns. There's the Kira Bell case at the moment, suing the Tavistock Clinic for a young woman who at 16 declared that she was male, went through hormones and then surgery, and now is regretting that and says, "Do you know what? I was so sure of this at 16. Now in my 20s, I bitterly regret that, and I wish somebody had just helped me to pause and slow me down. But actually, they just pushed me through." And that's the real concern. And at the BMA and in other places, we just see that shouting down of genuine questions. And I think we saw some of that
Is that
unease.
right? Actual physical shouting down. They'd actually boo you or transphobe you or whatever they say.
Well, I mean, it's very difficult on an online platform because people aren't able to shout out. But I think in a physical environment of a usual debating hall, yes, you'd be hearing the sort of the boos and this kind of thing, and there is that intimidation there. But you just know in the environment they are that a speaker will then get up and denounce you as being transphobic. So people have to be really, really careful in what they say. And we saw that with the briefing paper being hastily withdrawn, hastily rewritten on legal grounds, but really no time to say, well, these were the concerns and this is what we've decided to do. And with the high level of abstentions from that voting, I think that just reflects the fact that many people were uneasy. But rather than thinking, actually, yes, I'm sort of convicted enough to vote against this, then I'm just going to stay out of it. But that just gives more power to the strong voices that really want to push in a particular degree. And we see that really with research, with lots of other things, that people who have genuine questions really fear asking them openly because they fear being labelled transphobic.
So, but the other point that's sort of in my mind here is our legal case of David McCareth, who actually was, lost his position with the Department of Work and Pensions because he said he wouldn't call a 6-foot bearded man madam, which is being forced to lie about who someone is. And this is a medical thing, and it really shocked me when I saw this, to be honest, Mark. Because I sort of think, gosh, doctors are now for self-identification of gender. What will they want self-identification of next? If gender can be self-defined, what can we do? Can we self-define our own illnesses? Can we self-define our age? Can we self-define our own species? Can we self-define our own disabilities, other conditions? Well, where can this end?
Well, it opens up a massive can of worms, doesn't it? And many of your listeners will know about Rachel Dolezal, who's a black rights activist who was outed some time ago because although she's of white parentage, she identifies as black, and she sort of looks why she can just about get away with that. But when it became clear that she's actually ethnically white, but she identifies as black, she's rewriting the whole sort of what does it mean to be ethnic. So can we now tick the the black or Asian ethnic identifiers because that's how we feel, and you said age, lots of other things. So I think gender is just the sort of the next stage of the confusion. So we need to be really clear about that. I think underlying that there is a really genuine dilemma, because if you're a doctor looking after trans patients, these are not people who are coming in just knowingly telling a mistruth. Many of them, they really feel of that acquired gender. They really believe that they are because of the messages that are being put to them. So it is very difficult sometimes to work out exactly how should we refer to them, exactly how should we interact with them. But we have to try and get that balance between dignity and respect on the one hand, and then not just saying things that we know not to be true. And there are ways to do that. In my own prison GP work, I've dealt with numerous trans patients, and we've usually found a way to say, well, okay, here's what you believe, here are your needs. I hold a different position to that, but here's how we'll work that out together. You need to make it clear that you respect and give them dignity, but without necessarily buying into the ideology that they might be coming from.
So, Carys, we've got a question here from Zoe Wong on Facebook. What can we do? What can we do at this point? What can the supporter here, do in response to this news? We might have lost sound from you, Carys, there. I think we've lost Carys's sound, have we? Mark, what would you suggest we do?
Yeah, I think people need to be informed. They need to be educated, and there's some great resources out there. And I think we need to get used to asking good questions.
Go ahead, Carys.
One thing is that all of this is happening whilst the government has not published its. Are you right? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, maybe not.
We just got intermittent sound on Carys there, haven't we? Let me just jump in there. So I think getting informed and educated is really important, but learning to ask the right questions, and we need to do that in a way that actually communicates respect to individuals, but still isn't bound by pressure.
No, I agree.
Okay, because I think that whole narrative of unless you affirm me, then you're against me, you're phobic to me. We must challenge that. And this whole idea of bigotry and tolerance, they're two words that have been redefined in recent years. To tolerate something is to disagree with it, and yet to allow them to speak and to exist and to have a platform. Bigotry is what says, I am right, you are wrong, I don't care what you think, you do not have the right to speak, and your opinion is not valid. And we see those reversed, and we need to be able to challenge that. And I think we need to be able to speak out for children who are confused about their gender, and they need time, they need space, they don't need to be pushed down a conveyor belt. We need to speak out on behalf of clinicians who are asking these questions. There needs to be a safe space to say, look, we respect, we give dignity to those in the transgender community, but that does not mean we have to agree. And actually evidence and clear definitions of words must be maintained. And we can speak to our MPs.
The other side of this, which I'm sure Carys is going to mention, is that the government did a consultation. Carys, are you there now? Can you hear us? Should we try you one more time? You were going to talk about the consultation, the government consultation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was saying, Mark, that one of the things that we noticed over the last few months is how the government has not really published officially its response to the big consultation on the Gender Recognition Act, even though so many individuals and organizations responded to it. And what's been happening is that journalists have been picking up on it, and they published rumor, or a leak really, about what was going to be in it. But since then, many different, this week, many big corporations and some public sector institutions wrote to the Prime Minister saying they wanted self-recognition, self-identification. And this is basically bypassing the consultation process. It's a normal, lawful process of policy making before you introduce legislation. And there's been plenty of opportunity to respond. And I think the longer the government leaves it, the more lobby groups just shout and flex their muscles behind the scenes. And that should be a concern to the doctors as well as to the public, because it's introducing more of this confusion that you've been discussing and experiencing in the medical profession. So yes, I would encourage people to maybe think of talking to their MP about it, especially if they are a doctor.
Yeah, and
I agree.
It is quite shocking actually that point, Carys, about 80 major corporations like Disney and Microsoft writing to the government saying you should liberalize trans rights. So it just seems to all be coming out in one go, doesn't it? You've got the BMA on the one hand, the government see the BMA on the one hand and think this is representing all the doctors, when actually it's a few hundred votes from activists by the sound of things. And then you get these big corporations writing on the other hand, and then they see the way that J.K. Rowling's treated as well by the media and on social media and by bookshops and all this kind of thing as well. And, this is all kind of non-democratic, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. I think we really need to pray for those in government who were told by Paul to do that, the Apostle Paul to do that, and that's so clear here. We need to pray for those in government who are working up this response and hopefully publishing it soon, they need to not just cave into pressure. Of course, they need to listen to those from the trans community and take that into account, but we must not just dismiss the evidence of the other rights, women's rights, children's rights, and other things that could be ridden over roughshod by simply affirming trans rights. And I think for the government to stand firm and to put out a balanced response to this situation, it's just absolutely crucial. So let's pray for them to be bold and not just to simply cave into all the pressure.
Yeah. And I noticed, but maybe we'll finish with this question. Christina Spivey is asking on Facebook, do you think the word gender now means identity rather than biological sex? And I suppose, well, go on, Carys, I'll ask you first. Go on. Oh.
I think it's that's a good question she's asking. I think it's always actually meant that when you go back to the history of John Money developing it in pediatrics, and then it became in international treaties, it came to mean biological sex. So the Rome Statute, which is in our law, it's the International Criminal Court Act, I think, to check that, passed under Tony Blair, and then now it's been chucked around again, and people, it seems to mean whatever people, different groups want it to mean. So for some people it means biological sex, and for others it means a modified version of that. For others it simply means what you're performing or what you desire, that's in your head and your heart. So there is a lot of confusion.
Yeah, I think this language. Mark, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, confusion is rife, and I think we need to try to keep people thinking about that. Your biological sex is immutable. You can't change your chromosomes, and even if you have surgery and hormones, your cells still have that XX or XY in them, and the whole gender fluidity thing, the how you feel about what sex you should be, we need to not confuse that. And I think feeling female does not equate to being female. I'll maybe just finish with a little story about a patient of mine once, so a transgender patient of mine, so born a man living as a woman, and having some of the surgery and certainly the hormones, asked me, do you think, doctor, one day that they'll actually do a scan and find out that I have a uterus? And I sort of really had to pause before thinking, no, of course not. Your body is male. This is about how you feel. Your feelings are not an indication that actually your body is female. It's an indication of nothing more than how you feel about yourself. But that level of confusion is just incredible.
Yeah. Well, listen, I think we've run out of time there. But thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today and the insight that you've been able to give us on these BMA decisions. Thank you for the work you do with CMF and going along to these meetings and speaking out at them. We'll pray for you and support you, and I'd encourage other people to support you. And if you know people involved, do connect them with CMF. Thank you for what you're doing. It's great work. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening and engaging with us on Facebook and YouTube. Look forward to seeing you again next week at the same time around the table with Chris Concern. And we've also got a Gospel Issues seminar coming up on the evening of October the 5th about education, Christian education, which you might also want to put in your diary as well. So many thanks. Do share, copy, like, and all that kind of stuff. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.